Hello everybody, it's the new year. Let's have a New Year's resolution, and our resolution is gonna be not buy controllers that are bad for fighting games. Now you gotta remember, these controllers aren't necessarily bad controllers for other types of games, but they're just terrible for fighting games. Without further ado, let's get started. Now the first one we're gonna talk about is the 8BitDo Pro 2 G Classic Edition. If you've seen my previous video on the best controllers for fighting games, I've mentioned that the 8BitDo Pro 2 is one of the best controllers you can get for fighting games, but now it's also on this list. What gives? I'll tell you what, the controller itself, it's an awesome controller. The buttons are clicking. Shoulder buttons, triggers are awesome. Also got these back buttons as well. And I would argue that this version is actually better looking than the other versions. I just love the classic Game Boy look on this controller. Look at how beautiful these face buttons are. But as you know, the most important part of a controller for fighting games is the D-pad. And this is not necessarily a bad D-pad. In fact, it's a very good D-pad. It's very clicky and responsive. Diagonals are good. However, if you plan on playing 2D fighting games, this controller is terrible. And the reason being are these ridges right here on the D-pad. These guys are essentially speed bumps for your thumb, and they prevent your thumb from sliding around freely. It's really rough. Alright, check this out. Good luck doing motion inputs with this controller. This is crazy. They're like sandpaper. And this is such a shame because I love the look and feel of this controller. So hopefully they'll fix this D-pad for the Pro 3. Next on the list, we get the PS5 DualSense controller. And to be honest with you, I actually also love this controller as well for other games, except for fighting games. If you didn't already know, it's got resistive or force feedback triggers, which I think are awesome. And the rumbling feature on this controller uses haptic feedback. It's super cool. So when you walk through sand, you really feel like it's sandy. Or when it's raining, you really feel like it's raining. It's so immersive. The face buttons are fine. However, I do think they are a little far apart, so I would like these things to be a little closer so it'll be easier to press two buttons at once. Right now, it's a little tough to press both buttons at once. But what makes this controller really bad for fighting games is unfortunately the D-pad. On the surface, it looks exactly like a PS4 D-pad, and the PS4 D-pad is great for fighting games. So what makes this one so terrible? Well, the first thing is, this thing is so mushy. There's really no tactile feedback at all. But the worst thing about this D-pad is that it triggers unwanted diagonals. The buttons themselves look like 4 separate buttons, but in actuality, this is just one complete piece. They are all connected, you see that? Anytime when your thumb is slightly off angle, maybe on the side here, it's gonna trigger the adjacent button to get depressed and activates. So if you wanna do down like this, you're gonna do down back. And then same thing on this side as well. You're going to do down forward. This is going to result in your character doing moves that you don't want them to do, and really just one or two of these mistakes will cost you the match. To be fair, a lot of controllers have this problem, but this is the worst. The slightest angle is going to result in unwanted diagonal. I've lost so many matches over this damn D-pad. So if you play a lot of fighting games, do not get a DualSense controller. Next up, we have the PowerA Fusion Pro 2. This is actually a great pro controller. It's got a lot of features on it, but unfortunately again, it's not good for fighting games. It's got back paddles just like the Xbox Elite controller. And on the surface, it looks like it's so well built. Look at this. The handles are textured with this rubberized material. And you've got 3 levels of trigger stops. This is all the way. This is halfway. And at level 1, it acts just like a button. So it's got all the makings of a great controller that'll be great for fighting games, right? Unfortunately, the execution is very poor. So for one, these dome switches are so hard. And that carries over to this D-pad. The D-pad itself is fine. It's a cross-shaped D-pad, very similar to the Xbox One controller. However, I'm really not sure what kind of material they use for these switches, but they are super hard to press. After a while, your thumb's gonna burn like there's no tomorrow. You've gotta exert so much force to press these buttons. It's crazy. While the triggers are great, the shoulder buttons unfortunately are poorly designed. You see how the shoulder button are raised and protrude out all the way to the edge. Compare that to the Xbox controller, there's a taper right here to the edge. And this taper prevents accidental input when you're pressing the trigger. You see, it gets out of the way. And on this controller, you're gonna have to go through this protrusion to get to the trigger. You're gonna accidentally activate the shoulder buttons when you're trying to press the triggers. For the next version, they need to taper the shoulder buttons and they need to use switches that are not this hard. The next controller I got is the Hori OCTA controller. This controller is a 6-button fight pad, as you can see, with a little joystick here. The face buttons are actually great. They use my switches. And this joystick here is surprisingly good for fighting games. As you can see, there are these cutouts here similar to the N64 joystick. And you can really feel your way around because of this. Also, the stick itself is really short, so you can go from one position to the next really quickly. However, the D-pad is terrible. It's very difficult for me to do diagonals. It just doesn't activate. And I don't know why. I mean, it looks like a normal D-pad, so doing diagonal shouldn't be that difficult, but they just don't activate. So for example, when I try to do down back, either it just do back or down. And it comes with the software, and I've made all kinds of adjustments on it, still does nothing. So I'm not sure if this is a firmware issue or anything, because on the surface, it doesn't look like there's any design issues with the physical D-pad itself. And finally, we have the Razer Ryan fight pad. And this is a sorry excuse for a fight pad. I mean, the main purpose of this controller is for fighting games. And it's so bad. If you read the spec sheets, it's got all the goodies, right? The D-pad's got this 8-way switches, kind of like on an arcade stick. Right? That sounds amazing, no? And the buttons got these nice and responsive mice switches. But I feel like they never really test this on any fighting games at all before releasing it. First, let's start with the size of this controller. This is a huge controller. And I got big hands. I actually got really huge hands. But if you're somebody who has smaller hands, you're not going to be able to use this controller. X is down here, and then R1 is all the way up here. If your hands are small, or if your thumbs are short, it's going to be impossible for you to go from one button to the next. Secondly, these buttons are huge. Let's check out the PS4 face button versus this guy. They are ginormous. And I guess the idea here is they're trying to simulate an arcade stick on a controller. Well, if that's the case, you're gonna have to play claw like this, right? But I don't like playing it like this because it's super uncomfortable over long sessions. Moving on to the D-pad. This D-pad is just so satisfying. It's a floating D-pad and it's just so clicky. Unfortunately, when you actually get in a live game, this thing just does not work. And from what I know, this D-pad does not have a pivot in the middle. It's impossible to do motion inputs with this guy, let me tell you. Like if you do this, half circle, the down is going to be missing about 80% of the time. It's not going to register. It's practically impossible to do motion inputs with this D-pad. It's such a shame. Not only that, but the shoulder buttons is designed in such a way that you can only use it one way. I like to use my knuckles to hit the shoulder and the triggers, but with this one, I'm forced to use my fingertips. As you can see here, there's a slant. It's literally tapered all the way down at the edge here, so it's impossible for me to use my knuckles. So I'm forced to use my fingertip to activate the shoulder button here, but when I switch down to the trigger is so short. You see that? It doesn't match. Now I'm forced to press this trigger button using this part of my finger. And who presses the button with this part of your finger? That's just weird. If they're gonna have a design like this, the length of the trigger button needs to extend out evenly with the shoulder button. For a controller that's designed specifically for fighting games, it's just a terrible, terrible controller. Avoid at all costs. Alright, that's going to be it for me. Hopefully I've saved you some money. Hit the like button if you found it to be helpful. Subscribe for more and take care now.